heard that. Okay.
I kind of live in I live across the street from Skedston. So you have Evanston zip code, but kids are in the mixed Evanston Skokie school district. So
got it. Okay, so I'm going to welcome everybody quickly, and then I'm going to hand this off to Marianne. That's Rabbi Novak. My apologies. My name is Daphne Price, and I'm the Executive Director of JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance. I want to welcome everybody for joining us for this program that's titled Racist Matters in Our Midst, in partnership with Skokie Valley Agudath Jacob Synagogue. I want to thank Rabbi Ari Hart for his leadership. I do want to say a word about this program, that initially we were planning to do this program in person in Skokie at a Shabbaton on a Friday night, and it was scheduled to take place mid-March. And then COVID happened, and we obviously had to put those plans on hold. Always with an eye to returning. I remember the day that we canceled it, I left a message for Rabbi Hart saying, let's touch base and look at some date after Pesach when we can reconvene. And obviously that was a fool's dream, or we just didn't know what we were getting into. And so we're so grateful to be able to reconvene now over Zoom, and to be able to have people from all across the country. I want to also just put in a quick plug for other upcoming programs. Skokie Valley is also running a program on July 9th. Jews and the Black Power Movement. On July 23rd, looking at 1619, 1654, and 2020 Jews and Racism with Rabbi Mark Dollinger. I'm sorry, they were all with Mark Dollinger. And on August 6th, How to Begin Talking About Racial Justice with Julian Rollins Rishon. JOFA is also running additional programs on July 6th towards a better future, an interfaith conversation with various female clergy from across the religious spectrum. And on July 7th, we're running another webinar titled From the Playground to the Pulpit, How Latent and Blatant Bias Hurts Our Children, Parental Perspectives. And it's going to be a group of white parents who are in multiracial families, and having that conversation. You can find out more information on the JOFA website, jofa.org, and you can visit the Skokie Valley website for more information on those upcoming programs. And so I want to introduce Rabbi Marianne Novak. She recently graduated and received smicha from Yeshivat Maharat. She lives in Skokie, Illinois, with her husband, Dr. Noam Stadlin. She is an educator for the Milton Adult Education Program and a Gabait for the Skokie Women's Tefillah Group. I want to introduce Dr. Shira Roth, who grew up in Chicago in a Christian family with a father, mother, and two sisters. She has two adult children, a son, Kenneth, and daughter, Karen. She is married to Dr. Arthur Roth. Shira has had a long career as an educator, classroom teacher, reading specialist, literacy coach, professional developer, university professor, and author of 3 professional education books, as well as numerous professional journal articles. Currently, she is the chairperson of the Department of Education at Blitzstein Institute of Hebrew Theological College. And this will come up in conversation. I'm just going to add it here. Shira's conversion, which occurred on the 26th of Tammuz in 5770, was supervised by Rabbi Gelman and certified by the CRC. And a word about myself, as I said, I am the executive director of JOFA. I grew up in Toronto. I now live in Silver Spring, Maryland, spent a few years in New York. I am also a white person in a multiracial family. My husband's family, my husband and his siblings are multiracial, they're African American, and so this conversation, I imagine, will be very personal. I mean, all of the work that we do when you're talking about religion and barriers and overcoming them in any setting, whether it's Orthodoxy, Orthodox feminism, being in the workplace, et cetera, are personal. But this is kind of next level personal. I want to say also for myself, not all of the stories are mine to share. I'm going to try and share from my perspective rather than speak for the members of my family. This off to Rabbi Novak.
Well, welcome everyone. And as Daphne mentioned, we had planned to have this conversation as part of a JOFA Shabbaton, and it was something that was on our radar pre-pandemic, pre-everything else going on. And so kind of highlights for us that this was an important issue that we need to be talking about, and in the best way to, as Daphne mentioned, that this is more from the personal perspective, that I think people are being bombarded in a very good way with lots of information now, and sometimes that can be overwhelming. And then when we have personal stories, sometimes that is the best way to learn and to understand and increase your understanding and your range. So without any further ado, I want to begin with a series of personal jumping off point questions to get the stories going. And either Daphne or that we want to talk about to start to get these stories going is, what do people say when they first meet you within the Orthodox community? How's that experience been, and what does that reveal about us and what we get right and what we very often get wrong?
Shira, go ahead.
They say, do you work here? And when they find out I don't work here, they immediately want to know my story. Why did you decide to do this? So that's what I'm asked all the time. What's your story? Why do you want to do this?
Daphne?
Sure. So I have never, I think maybe once in my life, by showing up to Target wearing a red top and khaki bottoms, I was ever asked if I worked at a store. But otherwise, I've never been asked, and it's a mistake that I only made once. I've never been asked if I belong. Though certainly when I have been with other members of my family, those are questions that have come up. You know, people automatically ask, like, what's your background? Let's play a little Jewish geography. You know, are you Sephardic? Are you, you know, and those kinds of questions. But in direct contrast to you, nobody's ever asked me if I belong and why I belong, and whether I've taken a wrong turn, or what my status is for, or what brings me to where I am.
Yeah, that's the first. I heard someone else. That's the first assumption, that I made a wrong turn. What are you doing here? And the underlying, the hidden message is, you don't belong here.
Shira, when you're asked those questions, do you evaluate how much of your story you're going to share with that you go through when those questions are being asked, and what's the thought process that goes on there?
I try to be as succinct as possible. Do you work here? No. And I try to leave it like that. Sometimes they come back with more. The next question is, then what are you doing here? And my response is, Daphne. And you know, you get this surprise expression on their face, and then they go on, and I try to excuse myself. You're not entitled to my story. You've decided that I don't belong here, and you don't deserve my story. So I try to remove myself from the situation.
Daphne, when you're with your family and those kind of questions come up, are you the one to volunteer the information, or what kind of process do you go through?
So I'm going to share an old story, actually, that I know I said that I wouldn't necessarily be sharing other stories, but my father-in-law, when he was once traveling to Israel, all of the other kids went ahead. We all, you know, everybody else went ahead, and he was pulled aside. And he was asked, like, oh, you know, have you been to Israel before? All the usual questions. Have you been to Israel before? Have you not? Finally, you know, they asked, like, who do you know? And he started listing all of the members of the Israeli embassy who worked in Washington, D.C., and including the ambassador. And the security person was like, how do you know these people? And he's like, I'm their dentist. And so all of a sudden, it changed the frame of the conversation. But there are certainly times that we walk into, I should say that we are a firmly entrenched family in the Silver Spring area. So wherever we go, somebody knows a price. Also, there's a lot of, everybody resembles one another in the family. There's a strong underlying family resemblance. And so everywhere we go, it's not so much of, do you belong here? It's which price are you? Which is also, another set of assumptions. I have another close friend who is also of African-American descent, and people assume that my spouse, David, and my friend are siblings because they both share the same complexion. So there's a lot of underlying biases and assumptions that people make when they see somebody of a darker complexion or of a different complexion than what the standard Jewish look looks like. And the question of, or the comment of, you don't look Jewish, comes up again and again and again.
And when they say that, they think they're being funny. They think it's a
Right.
big joke. You don't look Jewish.
You don't look Jewish, exactly.
Right.
I mean, if you want to talk about assumptions, Shira, if somebody was to look at your name and my name, right, they might get different assumptions of what we would present and look like.
Right, right. Marianne?
Also, Marianne, you too.
Yes.
Yeah, yes, I've been asked very often if I was Jewish, and I think I want to move on that note to the other issue for you, Shira, because it's not only being a Black woman, but also being a convert and that extra layer. And I wonder if you could address some of your experiences with those double layers coming in your experience.
Well, as I said, everyone is always curious why I would do such a thing. Why would you do such a thing? And they want the story. I've tried to share the story in appropriate forums. A couple of shows have had Shabbos afternoon told my story. The community had a session about converts, and I participated on the panel. So, in an appropriate setting where I feel that it's more than morbid curiosity, it's a sincere request to find out about the process, I'm happy to talk about it. There is the assumption, I've had issues where, well, I'm a convert. Can I trust your kashrut? Can I accept a shiva meal from you, a homemade shiva meal for you? Those issues do come up. Do you know enough? Do you have it right? Clearly, they don't understand who I'm married to. That. Of course, I have it right. If I don't have it right, he's right there writing it.
Shira's husband is a wonderful Torah reader, a laner, and the most accurate one that I know as laner. So I don't doubt that from
and very knowledgeable, very dedicated to learning, and all these books are his books, so he reads them.
When we had talked before, Shira, in lieu of your conversion experience, you talked about living within the community and then having some degree of cognitive dissonance of seeing people within the community and their behavior not necessarily matching your expectations. I wonder if you could expand upon that experience for you.
Absolutely. When we think about racism in Judaism, in the Orthodox community, I would say it probably exists at a level just like there are Jewish people, there are Orthodox Jews who break the law and who get divorced and commit adultery. Same level, no, not the same level. I would say that it's less in the Orthodox community, but it still exists. And that is true for racism also. It still exists. I'm getting back to your question now. Remind me, I've gone far astray. Ring me in, Marianne.
Okay. So it's like in your personal experience as you were become part of the Jewish community, and then kind of, did it deter you, or when you saw us warts and all, how was that experience, and how does it how does anyone actually within the community manage what that might feel like?
I believe what I was learning. I believe that we were commanded to embrace the gear, embrace the stranger. And there was always a bit of discomfort when here's what I'm learning, here's what I see. That always made me a little bit uncomfortable. The process, and I can only talk from my point of view. When I went through the process and I was with other people who were going through the process, they seemed to have a very different experience. My experience was lengthy. It took a while. At one point, in the group that I was learning with, there was a couple who came in, and they were done in months. I've been at this for years, and they were done in months. And I wanted to know, wow, how did that happen? Why is it taking me so long? And they were done in a matter of months. So I struggle with, once the Rabbi Gelman, who supervised my conversion, spent time on the phone encouraging people to have me for a meal. So I stayed with him a lot. I stayed with the Steins a lot. I eventually gathered a group of people who I can stay with, so I didn't have to give all my money to the DoubleTree Hotel. Uh, and and it was a challenge for him. I had meals with him a lot. I had meals with the Steins a lot. There was a young man who, after I converted, when I went through this process, I said, when I convert, I am going to be the hostess. If any person is coming through and they want to convert, they are going to stay at my house. They're going to eat meals at my house. They're not going to have to worry. They're not going to have to give the DoubleTree Hotel any money. And then there was a young man, a year or so after I converted, I said, I'm all set. I'm calling him. I'm having him over. I couldn't get on his dance card. He was taken. Everyone was inviting him to meals. Everyone was inviting him to stay over. So that experience was incredibly different.
And do you, honestly, do you attribute it to the fact that you were a Black woman in this process, or a single woman?
There isn't anything else that I can identify. I don't know what else it could have been. You could say, oh, she's playing the race card, but what else was there? I thought I was a great guest. I stripped my beds after on Motzei Shabbos and brought it to the laundry room. I took care of their children so they could sleep in. I'm a great guest. Why wouldn't you want me?
That's the extra layer that comes with your experience. I want to move to one of the other things we actually talked beforehand, full disclosure to everybody, but Daphne, you were talking about with your husband and with your children, every now and then there's this kind of colorblindness that is thrown at you. And what is that experience like? And maybe kind of give us a heads up of how people do this very often.
Sure. So I want to say that I think that sometimes people forget. They, first of all, as I said, the prices are very entrenched in the community. And so for the people who are close to us sometimes forget. And that aside, there are people who forget that I am in a multiracial, or they don't know, or they haven't put it together, and they make assumptions about me based on I don't know what. But they, after, for example, after George Floyd was murdered, I had a parent call up and say, I think it'd be great if we brought in somebody to do a training on white privilege, for our kids. And I was like, that's great. Not all of our kids are white. And it just took her a second to be like, oh shoot, I completely forgot that. And then in another conversation, we were talking about the adoption process, and And somebody just said to me, I don't know why somebody would adopt a kid from another race. It must, there's so many added layers of confusion and whatnot. And I just looked at this person and was like, do you know who you're talking to? And again, it just didn't compute. And then then there are other times, I told this story yesterday, maybe it's the answer that I should have given before, when again, Israel, we're in a taxi cab, and the taxi driver leans over to me as I'm paying the fare, and my husband is emptying out the trunk, and he leans over and he whispers to me, is your husband Taimani in Hebrew? And I said, no. And he goes, I bet he's Taimani and he didn't tell you. As though, race or background or whatever would not have come up in our conversation before. So, those are like some examples. There are much more egregious examples where people have used really pejorative language referring to Black people, and even if I wasn't in a multiracial relationship, they would still get the death stare from me, because that's just not a way to talk, whether you use the N word or the S word in Yiddish. And so that, those are, and they'll say things like, oh, I didn't act Black, or you're not, like they will. And then the conversation also about Blackness also comes up, where people, and my children are very, very, very light skinned. One of them actually, I think, gets away with presenting as white, whatever that means. And they'll say both things like, oh, your kids aren't that Black, or, or, oh, of course your kids are Black and I see the features, or whatever. And it's just, people take liberties with saying things all the time. Sometimes it comes from a place of ignorance and love, and sometimes it comes from a place of ignorance and not love. It's just...
That trying to be kind, when they're saying something like, you're not that Black,
right,
it's they're trying to be nice. They're trying to say a nice thing. I've had well, there's this one family that did host me, and once to your race, wow. So what are you not saying when you say to me, I
right,
am a critic to my race? When they say to your children, you're not that Black, or you're a good one, you're one of the good ones.
right.
Shira, we can all take a beat there for a second.
Yep.
Shira, you had mentioned in your experience that since there are so few Black people within our community, that very often you are pegged as the representative for all Black people in the universe.
Yeah.
And if you would speak to that experience and how that plays out in our communities.
There's a gentleman at my shul, the whole 8 years that Obama was president. Whenever he had a quarrel with Obama, he felt compelled to come and tell me. I'm not his mother, I'm not his wife, I'm not him. Why are you telling me? And he insisted on doing this. Any questions? Well, there is I read this book. Do I get points for this? Do I get a cookie for reading The Color Purple? Yay for me. Making the effort, showing me, look at how liberal, look at how open-minded, look at how accepting I am. And when you make a point to go out of your way and find me and tell me that, I don't think they understand what that means. The exceptionalizing me. I don't think that I am exceptional. I think that I was a person who was called to this, who was drawn to this in my early adolescence, like 13 years old. I was drawn to. I was at Sinai, and eventually I found my way home. But I am not exceptional. Do not exceptionalize me.
Daphne, I'm wondering if you have that experience as well.
I'm sorry.
Of that of kind of being the, for you and your family as the representative of all things color that happen in the universe, that somehow you are connected and powerful in that manner.
So not so much, mostly because, no, actually, I don't think that so at my Shabbos table, actually, that's not true. That's not true. We have been at Shabbos tables where also, Barack Obama has come up, and my husband um, uh, did not vote for Obama, certainly not the second time. Uh, and and the reaction was, "But you're black. How could you not have voted for Obama?" And I think that there are assumptions that people make based on race, of where you fall. One of the conversations that has happened a lot more around the breakfast table, the lunch table, and the dinner table, as we're all home 24/7 these days, is questions of racial justice, and me being able to kind of see where the kids are and what they've learned in school, and my husband and his experience, and so the conversations have taken a different turn, and so the answer is yes, and also different internally in our own home.
And I think that leads into the next question of, especially in light of some recent very horrific events, where the lens on race is now much more focused. How the rest of the community, at this point in time, the majority of the community, which is not people of color within the Orthodox community, how are there ways to, how is that education going to work without having it put on the shoulders of people who are Jews of color within our community? So that's, what are your feelings of how we move this beyond just having you, Daphne, or you, Shira, as the receptacle for everything that is happening within our community? So if you would speak to that, that would.
I think that we get our attitudes on race from our families, from handed down from generation to generation. When children, the challenge for Jewish communities is that we all must be within walking distance of the synagogue. Segregated communities. It's what it is. It's a segregated community. The children do not have much of an opportunity to interact with people of another race. The people who they see who are not white are people who have been hired to do work in their house. And this is what they see. And parents don't have enough of an opportunity to model, this is how we feel, this is what we do, this is how we behave. They see their mother talking to the cleaning lady, they see their father talking to the gardener, and their interactions with those people are different than their interactions with their neighbors, their family, their friends. So children internalize, this is how we treat people of color. And without the parent intentionally explicitly teaching the child, this is what they're showing them. So as the community, I think we learn together. I think the forums like this, reading together, learning together. When you look at our tradition, who do we have in the Torah? Who do we have in Tanakh who isn't white? I lost his name now. Is it Shem, Noah's son?
Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi. Okay, and his tribe, the people who his descendants were black, and for Rav Ari, to a nod to my heritage. Well, Sipporah was a heroine. She saved Moshe. She circumcised her baby, and she was ignored because Moshe really had a big job to do, and there was no room for family. But Ham was a bit of a bad guy. His descendants were black, and that feels really uncomfortable to me. It's uncomfortable, like when I get up in the morning and I say and I'm davening and I say my blessings. I'm unhappy and uncomfortable to say thank you for not making me a Gentile, because guess what? I was made a Gentile. Thank you for not making me a woman. Of course, that's not the part that I say, but it's there and I see it in the sitter. And those things are uncomfortable. They're quite uncomfortable.
Daphne, you want to talk about roles of how to educate and where? Yeah, I know it's a large question, but beyond just the personal, and I think
Yeah,
the question
no, look,
is, the burden that you and Shira have very often is being, well, people coming to you like, now you educate me. Like, whose role is it to educate? What's the right best practices, as we like to say now, for communities and just families, as Shira
sure.
mentioned.
I mean, look, for me, I feel like I'm always learning. I have to say, before I started working for JOFA, I actually worked for the Washington office of the Reform Movement, the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism, and we did a lot of work with on racial justice. There was a march, I guess it's 5 years ago now, from Selma to Washington D.C. that we broke up into increments, and I marched 10 miles with the then president of the NAACP, Cornell Brooks, in rural parts of North Carolina where nobody was coming out to hug us, let's just say. And we had police who were protecting us along the way, and there were folks with Confederate flags who were driving by, and so there's some of that experience, some of that education comes from experience. Getting to sit down and talk to Brian Stevenson, who developed the Innocence Project and whatnot, and so there's that kind of education that that you can learn literally by experiencing and by being proximate to people who are different than you. But if we're talking about our formal Jewish day school education, we've got a long way to go, both from the perspective of what midrashim we teach and how we teach them, to the vernacular that we use in the classroom, to the sermons that are delivered from the pulpit. And Shira alluded to how that's heard, and when we talk about Sipporah as being Isha Kushit, and yes, that's a geographic origin, and the Mefarshim do all kinds of acrobatics to address that. When we talk about the curse of Ham, when we look at women who have been part of the conversion process, or who came into Israelite life, or who tried to come into Israelite life, whether it's Timnah, who was the mother of Amalek, whether we look at Ruth, whether we look at Sipporah, and what our Mefarshim, how the rabbis looked at and interrogated each of those women in our tradition, and how they also try to apply modern day, then contemporary, and now our teachers today, modern day lenses to those figures. And then, looking more broadly and looking at what our kids are taught in the classrooms, in particular, in my experience in Jewish day schools, I have to say that I was very pleasantly surprised when I took she was 15 then, she's 16 now, my daughter with me to the Museum of African American History with my Black Jewish Dialogue group. I sit on a Black Jewish Dialogue group as part of my, I sit on the board of my local JCRC. And I was very pleasantly surprised how much she knew going into the museum. If you haven't been to the museum and you plan on visiting Washington, D.C. when everything reopens, you should prioritize that for sure. The bottom floors look at the history of the slave trade, and then the upper 3 floors look at kind of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so the amount of information that she came in knowing about that, but and in at least for her, her education took a sharp turn, I think, upwards when racial justice again became a focus as a result of the murder of George Floyd, and talking about what it means to, Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter versus, why are we even talking about this in a Jewish setting? And I have to say I was pleasantly surprised, but I know that many other parents in other schools did not have as positive an experience talking about racial justice and trying to figure out how to fit that into the day school education. So critically looking at how we talk about non-Jews and people of other races within a Jewish text-based situation, and looking at the history that's taught in our schools.
Thank you. I think at the end, we will have some resources on the JOFA site of certain take-home, either educational materials and certain best practices. And I know Daphne has gathered from other synagogues some, and to take it upon ourselves to do the work that is necessary. Just one last layer. I know we're coming to the end of this part of the panel, but this is JOFA, and we're talking about women. And I want to just throw that extra layer in there, because within all the other isms, there's also sexism, and I want to know from your experience how that, I hate this word, but how it intersects, because that's how that happens to you within your experience, and also to make people aware of how those things very often come together, and somewhat overtly and sometimes not so overtly. But I think if you could address that extra, that added, that one more layer that is so important in our experience.
Sure. Shira, do you want to go? Do you want me to go?
Go ahead.
Okay. If we're looking at this conversation from a conversion lens, I think that the hoops of fire that women have to jump through, regardless of race, and definitely harder if you are not white, are much higher and much fierier and just tougher to overcome. And then once you overcome, and that has to do with, just to say, that has to do with because our Jewish descent comes from the mother side. So especially if you are young and if you are still looking to get married and have children and all of that, I think it is my experience, at least anecdotally, and I haven't done hard research on this, that it is a tougher challenge. I also think that the interrogation becomes that much more intense on the other side once women have converted. And I think that the digging that the Jewish community does to make sure, Shira, you alluded to this many times, that you belong, but also the question of what happens if you get married and want to have children, and and the status of your children, I think becomes a lot harder. On a macro level, if women are paid 73 cents on the dollar, women of color are paid much less than that. And in terms of just overcoming, oh gosh, all of the barriers, whether it's sexism, racism, ableism, socioeconomic barriers that people need to overcome. We did not even touch on the term structural racism, but being a woman is one more layer to overcoming all of that.
I went through 3 rabbis to Rabbi number 1 and Rabbi number 2. The president, I don't know what his title was, of the Beit Din, sat down with the directory and called rabbis and asked them if they would be willing to work with me. And he said, I have this very nice Black woman who wants to convert. Would you be willing to meet her? And thankfully, he didn't get down to Rabbi Zuckerman or Rabbi Zimmerman. It stopped early in the alphabet with Rabbi Gelman, who said, I will be happy to meet her. But you talk about the hoops being high and and line with fire and small that you have to jump through. There is a lot to go through. It's it's challenging. And when you are a Black woman, they more than once they shifted to, here you are and you're in my home, so you need to give me a hand. You know, help me clean this up, take care of the children. That happened a lot.
Just, I think we're all digesting that piece of information. So I think we're up to the point now. First, thank you for sharing these, I know, critical and uncomfortable moments that we need to be aware of within the community, and to spur us on to really do the work necessary in order to not keep this under wraps. And the part of getting anywhere is actually recognizing what the problem is and seeing it in all of its messiness and uncomfortable, and how it makes us uncomfortable. And uncomfortable is where we need to be if we're going to get anywhere. So Danny, have you compiled some questions that we can ask our panelists of now? And
yes, I'm sending them along to all the panelists now. We have 3 from here, and there's been a lot of engagement on Facebook. Even though there's been no questions, there's a lot of people following on Facebook as well. Okay, I sent you along 3. Give me a nod if you see them.
I see them. Starting with Jonathan. No?
from JOFA for Shira.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I see that now. Great.
Do you want to read it out loud?
Okay, I'll read it out loud.
Yeah,
Shira.
so our panelists can't see the questions. I mean, I'm sorry, we can see the questions. The attendees can't see the questions. So if we can just read them out loud.
Yeah, don't say. Okay. I think the question, what is your story, is reflective of racial assumptions, namely that an African American Jew must be a convert because Jews are white. Do you ever call that out? I'm going to stop right there. My daughter once says, you have a lot of experience negotiating white spaces. And I have that baggage. I was socialized, I was taught that I couldn't be loud, I couldn't stand up for myself, I can't be assertive. If I want people to like me, if I want people to accept me, I couldn't go on strong. That is on me. It's trying to get past those early lessons. And this is what I talked about, what we're teaching our children. That's what my mother taught me. That's what I internalized. And it's hard to get past those lessons. I'm going back to the question, do you ever call that out? No, and it's my fault, and I need to do it. We were having lunch with a group of people, and a woman was complaining about having a new doctor, having to go to a new practice, and looking at the names on the list and decided that none of those doctors were acceptable because of their name. And I sat there and I didn't say anything, and I'm still beating myself up over it. It's something that I have to learn to do. And the question was, do you think it's appropriate? Yes, it's appropriate. I think you can say it in a polite yet assertive way, which I need to learn to do. And the next question was, do you consider yourself of Black and Jewish, or a Black Jew, or something else? You know, I've never tried to label myself that way. There are 2 parts. Of course I am Black. You look at me, you see that I am Black, and I'm Jewish. I've never ranked them. I've never decided that I am Black and Jewish or a Black Jew. Not something I've considered before. I follow JOC on FB.
Jew of
And
color on Facebook.
Yeah.
they don't know that one. My daughter threw me one last week, BIPOC. I said, really? What's that? I'm learning so much. They consider themselves unique within the Jewish community and have formed their own sub-communities. Frankly, I think that's sad. I think so too. What do you think? I went to the shul was called Beth Shalom, and it's on Marquette Road on the south side of Chicago. On my long, long, long journey here, it is a congregation of Black Jews or members who are Jewish and Black, but they were not Orthodox. They had a fabulous kiddush that they were making on the spot with hot food. Oh, um, well, it wasn't Orthodox. So I went for one visit, but I decided it wasn't for me because that's not what I wanted. And it's gone now. Am I going to stop and am I giving someone else a chance? No. What suggestions do you have to combine a rigorous Jewish education and meeting people from other racial, socioeconomic, and ethnic backgrounds? I don't have a proposal for that. I would like it to be more unified. I think that another body needs to be in charge of the education, learning about Shabbos, learning about Hagim, learning about keeping mitzvot, that another body, I don't know who, can do that, because it's a lot to put on a rabbi. If you are a rabbi and you have children and you have other responsibilities, to fit in time to work with the convert is enormous. And you make the agreement that you're going to go to this shul, you're going to daven at this shul, and a rabbi can say, yes, in fact, you're there and you are participating, but someone else can do the education part. And maybe in that forum, you can see people of other socioeconomic and ethnic backgrounds. And I'm going to
I want to tack on to that there are, at least in our JCRC here in the Greater Washington, and I'm sure it's true, and if it's not true, then it should become the norm at JCRCs across the country. The job of the Jewish Community Relations Council is to engage with people outside of the Jewish community. So in at our JCRC, there are several opportunities for high school students. One of them is to go into public schools and to kind of engage with public school kids. They learn about Judaism, and there's a give and take. And there are plenty of students who are Orthodox, affiliating and identifying, who participate in that. And another is a model of Operation Understanding, where you have Black teens and Jewish teens who primarily are not Black, or otherwise other non-white identifying, also engage in regular dialogue. And I want to say that being in regular dialogue and not, let me say two things. It's very important to support communities in need. So whatever that is, if somebody needs a tutor, if there's an organization that's doing the work in that space, to financially support them, to show up in ways that are meaningful, but also being in close proximity to one another goes a long way. And so I think that, yes, you can have a solid yeshiva education, a solid day school education, and find ways outside of because the school days just don't allow for those kinds of things always during the day, except for when they do, but to find other engagement opportunities outside of the school day.
A question that came up that I'm looking here is that, do we find that the behaviors that you've experienced unique only in the Orthodox Jewish community? And maybe Daphne, you can speak to this a little bit, since you've been in other Jewish spaces. And actually, Shira, it seems like you have traveled through many different Jewish, primarily white spaces, and what your experience has been. I think that is something that might be interesting for us to know about us as a community in general, what we need to do.
So, I mean, I can answer that very quickly. No, the attitudes and behaviors are not unique to the Orthodox community. As I said, I've professionally and as a layperson been in multiple settings. Jews of color are sometimes singled out and also made to feel not fully welcome in every setting that's predominantly white, whether it's a Reform temple, whether it's an Orthodox day camp, and everything in between. And we also, I'm sorry to say, see it in our leadership of how many Jews of color run organizations that are not dedicated to working on diversity. How many board members, and this is something that we're grappling with also at JOFA, or that who are on the board who are not white identifying or Ashken normative, or however way you want to approach that. So it's not, it is, let me assure you, for better or worse, and I guess worse, it's not limited to the Orthodox community. Unfortunately, implicit bias cuts across all lines of denomination in the Jewish community.
Shira, you wanted to talk about your experience, if you found the same unfortunate bias?
I'm thinking of non-Orthodox experience. When I was in high school, my friends were conservative, and once in a while, I went to their little brother's bar mitzvahs, and I went to BBG with them, but I didn't go to shul with them, and of an understanding, and I was a child. There was acceptance. No one, and I talked about Beth Shalom on Market Park on south side of Chicago. It was an African American community, so of course I was accepted. They convinced me that they attempted to convince me that this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to become a part of their community. And I said, yes, but I live in Niles. I'd have to drive here. I would have to be hosted every single week, like when I wound up in Skokie. And they said, it's okay, you can drive. So it was not the place for me.
One of the other questions here, I think this happens to a lot when you have a family member or someone at your Shabbos table. When those inappropriate racist comments come, is there, and again, we are asking you as opposed to us educating ourselves, but maybe a way that we should think about approaching it, and how important is it to do it even if it might ruffle some family feathers?
Do you want to start, Shira? Do you want me to?
Absolutely. This is my challenge. This is my goal. I need to stop being a good girl, and I need to call people on it. I think that I can do it in a polite and respectful way to let them know this is not okay. And the reason it happens is because good girls like me have allowed it to happen.
Hurts my heart.
Sorry, your heart.
So I have to say that I call it out whenever I see it. We have a relative who still refers to, who not anymore, but had referred to her housekeeper as a, I don't even want to say it. It starts with an SH. I and I would call her out on it and tell her how offensive and sexist and awful and just not behooving of her to use that kind of language. And I think, Shira, you alluded to this. It's what we learn. It's how her parents, addressed or spoke about the housekeeper, whatnot. I will say also that when my now spouse, when we first got engaged, and I introduced him to my 85-year-old great aunt, who at the time was like all of 4'11". This is back in the late 90s, and I introduced them, and he, gave her a big hug, and and she was like, "Oh, you're so cute." and all of my cousins were like, "You can't say that." And she, like, for her, first of all, she spoke Yiddish. She was Polish. That was just her. That was her mama and everything. Had a very heavy accent. But that also took explaining. The people who are blatantly racist, and who it's not because it's what they learned, it's not because it's their language that they default their, that's their default language. Yeah, I call them out, and I think that it's on all of us. Certainly, if we want to talk about what it is to be a good friend and to be a good ally, then yes, then we need to call it out. And I think that even things like, when somebody's like, oh, what's your conversion story? I think that there's a polite way to be, or maybe not polite, but just a way to say like, maybe since this is the first time that you're meeting one another, it's not the right time for you to have this conversation. That's a personal conversation. And Shira, I don't think I have ever asked you that question. But yes, but when people say blatantly racist things, I call it out. And then there are some people that are, we just won't be breaking bread together again.
Yeah, and I think that's the risk, the part that you have to take, and that there'll be pushback, and expect that, and it might be pushback for a while, but to understand how important it is in the overall scheme. One last question that I'm looking at here, and we are running out of time, but again, I think people are asking for take home of how we do the work to get rid of those implicit biases within the Ashkenormative Orthodox community, which I'm certainly a representative of, and how what those take-home steps will look like in those personal settings when you have someone at your table or a relative, but also communally, and then also, as Shira mentioned, in those family units of how that works, and also the degree of unlearning inherent behavior. So I think we will have some tools from JOFA on the JOFA website for people to follow up and to begin the process of the work that we in the Ashken normative, mostly Orthodox Jewish community need to be doing. I just want to thank both of you for being so open and honest and helping us take those steps to really do the work that absolutely needs to be done right now, and to be so gracious to call out our terrible experienced through you as human beings, not as institutional entities. Even though Shira, people keep trying to make you one. So on that note, any other closing words from either of you?
Well, Shira, I want to thank you, and I want to thank you, Rabbi Novak, and I want to thank Rabbi Hart for really, coming together in the category of better late than never. And I think that this is in some ways a more important and more timely conversation, and also the ability to bring people from all across the country to be able to have this conversation. As I said at the outset, there are a number of upcoming programs, both through Skokie Valley, through JOFA. I also encourage you to check in with your local JCRC and Federation to see what they're doing, and if they're not necessarily followers of JOFA or members of Skokie Valley, same thing. Pick up the phone and call your synagogue and find out what they are doing, and if they're not, why they haven't. And if it starts with a book club and a committee and a conversation, then that's what it starts, but make sure that something happens from there. I also just want to add in, if anybody has any specific feedback, they can email Dani, D-A-N-I, at dani@jofa.org. But this is a first step. I think it's an important step, but it's certainly not the last step. And so again, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank our panelists, and onward.
Shira, do you have any last words? No pressure. No pressure. I appreciate the opportunity. I have what I'm taking away from this is that I'm not going to be quiet anymore. I'm not going to let these slides pass anymore. And this gave me the impetus to go forward with this. And I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful day.
Have a great day, everyone.